You're welcome to today's webinar. It's on conservation action, and it's more like a workshop where we learn how to carry out conservation workshop. And today we have two amazing, fantastic speakers. We have Professor Axel Hochkirch, and he's the head of conservation biology at the National Museum of Natural History, Luxembourg. And he's also the co-chair of the IUCN SSC Invertebrate Conservation Committee. And we also have Vicky Wilkins, who has over 22 years of experience in invertebrate recovery across the UK and internationally. She works as the Species Recovery Program Manager at Species Recovery Trust, and she's also co-chair of the Invertebrate Conservation Committee and also Atlantic Island Invertebrate Specialist Group. So we have wonderful speakers here with us today who are going to hold our hands and guide us on how to carry out conservation action beyond what we probably know from our universities or what we know from research. Quick things to know is that this session is actually recorded, and also is the fact that we'll be using a mirror whiteboard later in the session. And we'll be moving on to our first speaker for today, who is Vicky Wilkins. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll just share my presentation. Oh, 2 seconds. Great. Hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, so hi, great to meet everyone. Yeah, and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm kind of going to focus on invertebrates because obviously both me and Axel are invertebrate specialists. They're obviously quite different to species recovery on some other types of animals, but equally we have to be super inventive with invertebrates because there's a lack of funding and a lack of kind of focus on invertebrates. So I like to think that it makes us like particularly dynamic as invertebrate recovery specialists. I just thought I'd do a quick slide on sort of my background, yeah, which has been quite diverse. I obviously work in the UK and I've worked for a range of different charities in the UK, but then I also branched out to work internationally. I worked in Tanzania for a couple of years, and then I worked for Flora and Fauna International, focusing on Central Asia, which was actually beyond invertebrates. It was a number of kind of different projects, both on habitats and species. But as you can see, I've had quite a long history of doing a lot of voluntary work as well, which I think has really helped shape my career. And I really recommend as like early sort of career conservationists to really look at kind of doing voluntary work when you can, because it can really broaden your horizons and give you lots of extra additional skills. So kind of when to act, I was going to start with. Obviously, there's kind of lots of kind of options in terms of kind of things that you can do, and often we start off our careers in research, doing degrees, focusing on the very kind of academic elements of work. But kind of when do you really translate that research knowledge and understanding that we have on species, when do you translate it into actions? So at the IUCN, we have a system called Assess, Plan, Act, which is about initially assessing a species using red listing, which you're probably really aware of, where you look at the threats of a species and make an assessment of that species in terms of either its population or its distribution, and then assess, kind of give it a global threat status based on that. So that's always kind of the first element, particularly in the IUCN, that we look at. We also encourage quite strongly planning, because it's really important to bring everybody together and look at your evidence base and figure out what are you actually going to do next for a species. So planning can be incredibly important. And then finally you get to action. to acting. So once you've kind of done your assessment of a species, how threatened is it? What do we know about it? And then look at your kind of planning, kind of who needs to do what where, then you kind of make sure that you get your actions on the ground happening. This kind of breaks it down into quite a very simple system, but obviously real life is not quite as simple as that, but I'll delve into that a bit more. Kind of which species to focus on. Very specifically for me, and quite a lot of us working on invertebrates, we look at very kind of unique species, obviously those with high threat statuses, but I also very specifically working on islands look at endemic species, so species that are very unique, very restricted, and often as a result have high threat statuses because their habitats are very limited. Yeah, as we've mentioned, threat status is really important. This can be at different levels. You can either have a global status, so know kind of internationally what that species is doing, but also we have red listing at a regional status, so often at a country level. But sometimes also things like a European level, we also have threat statuses for species. So even though something is threatened in a country, it might not be threatened globally, but still that country wants to conserve that species because they want to retain it in their country. It's obviously really important to understand the threats of the species. That's a really important first step before you do anything. Really, as part of your planning exercise or a part of any exercise, even if you're not doing planning, really boiling down to what are the threats for that species is really, really critical. Because really understanding those defines your actions. Quite often we look at, in terms of planning, about flipping the threats. So flipping a threat into an action. What do we actually need to do to reduce that threat? What actions need to happen? And then obviously having a species conservation plan can be a very good sort of preparatory part before you start to take your actions. That might be a single species plan. It also might be a multi-species plan, or you might be looking at integrating species into other types of plans like protected area plans. In terms of type of actions, you get lots of different types of actions. Obviously, kind of research and monitoring is kind of the first one, again, that most of us are very familiar about, learning about that species. Where does it live? What does it do? What do we know about its population? What do we know about its distribution? This all helps define like what actions you'll take, the location of them, and also helps you understand the threats and the impacts on that species. Habitat management is obviously really key. Understanding a habitat that a species uses, how it uses it, and then looking at expanding that habitat, improving it, reducing the fragmentation of that habitat is often a key component. Threat mitigation, for example, I work on islands, I work a lot on invasive species, so we often do threat mitigation around removing or reducing the impact of invasive species on some of these very rare invertebrates. But you also may be looking at a policy level. If you're looking at something like an aquatic species, you may be looking at influencing how a river catchment is managed to protect that species or improve its habitat. Outreach and education, often people latch onto these kind of actions in terms of a species, but one thing that can be a bit of a pitfall is being really clear what that outreach is going to achieve in terms of the recovery of the species. Often your action planning can help with this because you very much want to link that outreach and education back to a specific goal that will actually lead to the recovery of a species. A nice example is outreach with landowners, so very much influencing the perspective of those landowners, so they will actually then conserve that species if it's present on their land. And one really important element as well of actions as a kind of complete set for species is thinking about funding and resources and leadership for species and its conservation plan or associated actions. Because without those elements, then its recovery will be very very limited. You obviously need capacity to be able to deliver actions, and you definitely need leadership to bring all the stakeholders together to deliver the actions in an effective way to enable recovery. Yeah, as I mentioned, something that I do quite a lot is conservation planning. This is an example of a UK species that I did and has now been kind of used nicely as an example of high quality conservation planning in the UK for a species. Quite often for larger species, these can be like week-long exercises. We actually managed 2 days for this bumblebee, but quite often for a lot of other invertebrates, I just manage day-long exercises in planning, because there just isn't the capacity or the resources for people to engage with invertebrates in the same way that they can with tigers or bigger, more charismatic species where there's more funding. So quite often you have to be dynamic and adaptable in kind of how you apply the work that you do for species to initiate actions. It's not always, it doesn't always have to involve kind of lots of funding as ways of doing it. But plans can be a really nice way to kind of bring stakeholders together. So you provide a vision for a species, kind of a wide scale kind of thing that you want to aim for, and then you break that down, looking at the threats, and then look at the goals and eventually the actions that you want to deliver for a species. But it can be a great way of initiating conservation action. I just wanted to mention as well sort of technology and conservation action. So it's becoming increasingly sort of well used with invertebrate work, and it can be a great way of getting better research and knowledge, those types of actions delivered more effectively. Particularly audio monitoring is becoming more used. AI, you're probably all very familiar with things like iNaturalist is becoming more effective, and we do integrate that into a number of our projects because it can be very effective for invertebrates where capacity for monitoring is limited, and the same with DNA. So I'm going to talk about some case studies. This one is a case study from the UK. It's a very charismatic beetle that's red listed in the British Isles as being endangered. It probably is more widespread in Europe. It's not actually red listed in Europe, but yeah, in the UK it has been identified as a conservation priority. It's a wetland species. It lives particularly on a riverbank near a city, which happens to be the city where I live. And it gets called the tansy beetle because it mainly eats the tansy plant, particularly on the riverbanks in York. It mainly eats the tansy plant. Because it's so charismatic, back in 2009, an action group developed around this species. So that was kind of coordinated, a group of different organisation and people wanted to come together to conserve this species. And so that was kind of a really nice driver for the long-term conservation of this species. And because of where it lives and because it's so charismatic, we have managed to get sort of good funding and good volunteer effort for this species. So each year we have quite an extensive monitoring piece of work that's done for this species. Over 30 transects over 45 kilometres is done every year with volunteer surveyors collecting notes on where its food plant is and the number of beetles that's present on that food plant. So a very simple citizen science exercise, and then that data is all collated together, written into a report, and all the data is also mapped. And we do collect information about invasive plants as well that can impact its food plants. And using those reports, using that data, we develop a survey report, but we also develop a series of maps which show basically the lighter colours that they are basically smaller clumps of food plant for this beetle. The darker colours, like the reds and the purples, are larger food plants. The top map is sort of an earlier year. I think this was about sort of 20 sort of 2023. And then by sort of 2024, you can see after some targeted management by the landowners based on some management reports that Species Recovery Trust delivered to them about where they needed to targeting increasing food plant areas, then we did actually see that kind of increase in the size of food plant areas for the beetle, and as a result, the occupancy increased. So those green numbers is actually the number of tansy clumps that are occupied by beetles. So you can see that kind of increase from one map to the other. Yeah, and we do actually have a conservation plan for this species as well. So all this work is sort of embedded in there and delivered by different actors on this beetle, with Species Recovery Trust and others sort of helping to gather data and facilitate the monitoring as well as writing the reports, but then landowners and others actually delivering on the ground conservation work, planting food plant, reducing threats such as invasive plants. So it's quite a nice, effective way of sort of multi-actors working together on the conservation of this endangered beetle. Other species that I work on is like this rare bee. This is located in a few sites in North Yorkshire. It's another priority species in the UK for its conservation. It's seen significant declines. It lives on kind of heath edges. Again, very specific food plant type. Generally impacted by inappropriate management, overgrazing. So again, a bit more difficult to ID this one, so not so many volunteers. A few specialist volunteers, butterfly surveyors, go out and do surveys for me. Again, collating that data, writing management reports and delivering that to the landowner, who is a mix of Forestry England and Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. They've altered their management to improve the food plant for the bee, so there's a lot more tormentil on a particularly key site, and the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust has been digging out open sandy areas, and we've seen these areas being used by the bee, and we're starting to see that impact in our monitoring as well. And a final UK species is this critically endangered soldier fly found on seepages and wet toother moss. Again, this had been kept an eye on by a volunteer dipterist, but we've started doing more larval surveys for it to understand if the larval levels are high enough so we can translocate it onto other sites as well, because it's on a single site. So translocation is starting to become a more kind of accepted sort of area of work, particularly inverts. It wasn't used very strongly before, but we increasingly, with these incredibly threatened species, realise we need to get them onto multiple sites. With climate change and extreme weather events, they're very at risk of going extinct if we don't get them onto more than one site, and this is what we'll ultimately be trying to do with this species. So in terms of my international work, I work on islands, particularly the UK overseas territories, where there's ridiculous amounts of endemism, really high numbers. So on the UK overseas territories, we have over 1,000 invertebrate endemic species, which is a huge percentage of all the endemics on the UK overseas territories. A lot of these islands have a lot of challenges. They don't have a lot of funding. They don't have a lot of knowledge or skills about invertebrates. Even though they do often have kind of conservation teams active on islands, they're often focused on bird species or specific habitats, sometimes marine as well. And there's kind of quite low capacity. They don't have very big teams as well present on island relative to the quantity of endemics they have. So I'm going to talk through a couple of these islands. So St Helena, which has this amazing flagship, the spike yellow woodlouse, which is a photograph here, has over 400 invertebrate endemics, so a massive number. To try and conserve. We started back in 2012 working on St Helena, and that's when the IUCN associated sort of island group for the Atlantic also was set up partly on the basis of this project and the high need for high levels of red listing. We now have over 220 species from St. Helena red listed for a variety of different projects. We've managed to achieve that. And we've got a couple of plans as well, an island-wide endemic invertebrate plan. So that's a multi-species plan because it was acknowledged that we needed something to try and cover all of the endemic invertebrates, many of which are listed as either endangered or critical because their habitats are so small now. But we do have a single species plan for the spiky yellow-wood louse as a key flagship. What we have achieved over the last sort of 15 odd years has been the embedding of invertebrates into the conservation projects on islands. So currently there's a big cloud forest project because this is like a key habitat on this mountainous island. There's a forest which is found at the top of the mountains of the island, which is just crammed with many different endemic invertebrates. So a big restoration project was applied for that cloud forest to be restored. And because we'd raised the profile of the invertebrates, we had the red listing. We've also got things like a field guide for the invertebrates. And we also have a team on island working on the National Trust who actually flagship invertebrates on the island now. That meant that the endemic invertebrates were fully embedded into that project. Both their monitoring and their restoration was both two key components of the project. As a result, the team at the National Trust has been undertaking monitoring and restoration and advice. And as a result, we've started to detect endemics in the cloud forest in the restoration areas. The team is also working on invasive invertebrate control, both common wasp, Vespula vulgar, and also big-headed ant by Phydola megacephala as well. Is also part of that work as some of the key threats for these really incredible and very rare and threatened endemic invertebrates that occur on the island. A couple of pictures demonstrating that. So you've got a picture of the social wasp eating an endemic horrorfly. And we got a really nice piece of work done through that project as well to do DNA references for the endemic invertebrates. So we could then use that for monitoring, and some stomach content work that was done actually showed the high number of endemic invertebrates that are being eaten by the common wasps, which then enables us to kind of get more funding and more capacity to actually then eradicate and control the wasps on island. There's also the blushing snail here, which is just to demonstrate that not all the endemic invertebrates are super rare or threatened, like the spiky yellow-wood louse, which is critically threatened. This one's actually near threatened and is fairly widespread on the island, living on a wide range of different habitats. So it's definitely not a conservation priority for us, but there are many others which makes things very challenging. Ascension is another island, a sister island to St. Helena. We initiated work on there, sort of semi-similar, setting up a project, this time working with the government because there isn't a national trust on Ascension, but doing some first stage assessment survey work on Ascension because its baseline data wasn't quite as good as St. Helena. St. Helena had quite a lot of historical entomologists visiting and gathering data. So we used that when we first started to work on St. Helena, whereas Ascension, we kind of needed more sampling. As a result, we got a really high quality data set plus 4 new species to science, 2 pseudoscorpions, a woodlouse, and also a spider species. As well as doing red listing, we've red listed a number of species on Ascension. It's not quite as many endemics, it's only 30, it's a younger island. It's had quite a lot of habitat change as well. But as a result of all this work, the government have started to embed the endemics into their work. They've created 2 new protected areas for invertebrates. for the pseudoscorpions and scaly crickets that live on the coasts that weren't naturally embedded into their other PA work. But for the other endemic invertebrates and the other actions, they've all been embedded into the protected area management plans. So they didn't feel it would be useful to have separate species plans or even an invertebrate strategy. They very much, as a low capacity island, wanted it all embedded into what they were already doing. So that's how we tailored that project to them. And here's, a couple of the species. There's an endemic barkfly, a Secoptera on Ascension, and then that's the new species of endemic woodlouse that lives in turtle nest that was found as part of the project. And just to highlight, log frames and planning for projects is really important and is definitely a skill I'd encourage you to have a look at, because it's very important in terms of fundraising as well as defining what your actions should be for a project, having this kind of very structured way of having outcomes, looking at indicators and verifications in terms of the work that you're delivering. Another island that I work on that's very different is Montserrat. They have 290 regional endemics and 118 single island endemic invertebrates. So we've done quite a big exercise collating their data for them. Culturally, invertebrates are not well loved on the island. Most are considered pest species. So rather than doing a big initial project, we've kind of embedded pollinators into a number of the projects that they've been doing as a kind of suite of invertebrates that people sort of understand the benefits for. So we particularly encourage iNaturalist work around pollinators, and iNaturalist has actually provided a lot of baseline data for Montserrat for us to start to use, and then also butterfly monitoring scheme as well is starting to be used on Montserrat. So again, we had to do a very different approach for that island to what we did in St. Helena and Ascension. Just quickly to conclude, again, as I said, sort of assess, plan, act. It's always good to kind of roughly use that structure, but not perfectly, because you might not always do a perfect conservation plan, but you might do some sort of planning exercise, whether it's a planning exercise to embed your species into another piece of work. It's always good to start with the assess bit. What do you know about the species? Has it been red listed? What's that knowledge base? Then you collect planning and then move on to your actions. But one thing to stress is that you don't necessarily need all the information to act. You do need a good evidence base and definitely some expert advice, but we often run projects for invertebrates, gathering information while we also do actions based on the information that we know. So we kind of building that knowledge up. Even something like tansy beetle, which I've worked on for over 20 odd years now, I'm still kind of learning new things about its requirements. We've just realised how important sort of late mowing is for the tansy plant to actually help with the strength of the its growth and the clumps for the beetle. You definitely want to kind of run things in conjunction rather than trying to be too successional. Each species and each group of species or wherever you're working needs a unique approach. You can obviously take things you've learned, but you always need to adapt. You need to be dynamic, creative, and definitely collaborate. You're always stronger with other people. And it only helps to kind of work with others who are on the ground or know the area. And it's not always the obvious people either. It's also the landowners and the people that are kind of living with the species. Even if you come up with some negativity, you should always keep that dialogue open and learn from them. Just saying that species, you can do them individually, but you can group them or you can look to embed them into other initiatives. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vicky. Very interesting projects. First, before we continue with my presentation, I would like to give a short overview of the aims of this workshop. So first, you realize we had a little bit to shift the order because I I messed up my presentation when I saved it yesterday. I have two presentations today, and I saved the first one the second one and overwrote the first one. So while Vicky was speaking, I have actually created a new presentation, and this will give you a short introduction into the IUCN SSC, or the Invertebrate Conservation IUCN SSC, and also a little bit what we do in the Grasshopper Specialist Group on conservation planning. And finally, after that, we will have a more interactive format. And that during this process, we will discuss together in a case study how we could start conservation action for a certain species. So what would be the most important action to find out what would be necessary to turn all the knowledge we have into conservation action, because that is one of the major problems in the IUCN SSC. We have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of academics in many of the specialist groups, and they provide the assessments. Some of them engage in conservation planning, but usually we do not have the knowledge on action. And that is good about Vicky because she works for a conservation NGO who do a lot of conservation action. And and I think we have to learn from them, because as academics we know how to do research, but we don't know how to do action. And that is why it's so important also to collaborate with the right actors, with the right stakeholders, particularly conservation NGOs or the authorities or whatever. We cannot do everything by ourselves. Yeah. Okay, so I will give first a short presentation on the Invertebrate Conservation Committee, which we chair, and then we will move on. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you see that. It's not perfect because I have really put it together in haste now. But anyway, so first, you probably know all about the IUCN because I guess most of you are members of the IUCN SSC Youth, the Young Professional Group. Is this correct? Or are there also people from outside that network on board?
Yes, there are probably people from outside the Young Professional
Okay.
Task Force joining too.
Okay, so maybe it's good to have a good short overview. So IUCN is the largest, oldest, and most influential conservation NGO. It was founded in 1948 and has 1,400 member organizations from more than 160 countries. And these member organizations can either be states, so many countries on the planet are members of the IUCN, or the government agencies. Also, a lot of NGOs like WWF or Buglife International are members of the IUCN. Also, indigenous groups are meanwhile members of the IUCN. So there are a lot of groups of people who are members of IUCN. So we actually, as commission members, are not members of IUCN. We are members of the commissions of IUCN. The IUCN has a secretariat with 1,000 full-time staff in 60 countries. There are 45 regional offices. The headquarters is in Gland in Switzerland. And something very special about IUCN is that it has an official observer status at the UN General Assembly, which means that they can really influence global conservation policy. And they have drafted a lot of policy documents. For example, the first versions of the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, was more or less written by the IUCN. And of course, the IUCN is known for its knowledge products, which is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which may be the most best known one. But there's also World Database on Protected Areas. There's a Global Invasive Species Database. There are key biodiversity areas. And also there are a lot of guidelines and standards which are internationally used. Every 4 years, there's a World Conservation Congress. The last one just took place 2 weeks ago in the UAE. And during this World Conservation Congress, all the members are present, and they vote about so-called motions, which are then turning into resolutions. So each member of the IUCN can provide a motion for the Congress together with some other members, and then there will be an election, and they will see which of these motions become official IUCN policy. The current president, Razan Al Mubarak from the UAE, is very engaged in species conservation. She has, in fact, supported the IUCN SSC over several years, and she is also the managing director of the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund. So she has really good knowledge of species conservation, which is really good because she's really the head of the complete union. And the Director General, Gretel Aguilar, is also a quite engaged person. So we're quite happy about these two persons on the top of this union. I already mentioned the commissions. The commissions are a network of experts who give advice to the IUCN and its members. So that is official role. But these commissions are also very active. For example, the World Commission on Protected Area is maintaining the World database on protected areas. And the SSC is a Species Survival Commission, which we are a member of, and where also the Young Professional Group belongs to, is of course mainly dealing with species conservation. The IUCN Red List is mainly created by members of the SSC. And of course, a lot of policy documents, also engagement in in CITES or other policy conventions. So the Species Survival Commission has a chair. The new chair is Vivek Menon from India, who has been elected just 2 weeks ago on the last Congress. And the deputy chair is Rima Javado. And there's a steering committee of, let's say, 10 to 20 people who are meeting regularly to discuss more or less administration of this large group of different specialist groups with more than 11,000 people. And between the specialist groups and the steering committee, there are also committees who take care of more or less heading or giving a more strategic advice about the formation of new specialist groups or generally policy documents and so on. And me and Vicky, we are the chairs of co-chairs of the Invertebrate Conservation Committee. And below that, we find all the so-called working units of the SSC. And the working units are the specialist groups, of course. We have taxonomic specialist groups. So I'm chair of the grasshopper specialist group. Vicky is the chair of the Atlantic Island Invertebrate specialist group. We have also national species specialist groups, like the Chinese specialist group. You can see the logos here on the bottom. Or thematic specialist group, like invasive species specialist group. We have red list authorities, which are only doing red listing, like TERLA, the Terrestrial Invertebrate Red List Authority. Or we have task forces. Task forces are usually have a more specific task, which they have to deliver in a certain time. So they're usually not a permanent structure. For example, there was a task force on systemic pesticides, which has mainly created a large review on the effects of systemic pesticides on insects. Well, we are chairing the Invertebrate Conservation Committee. That means we are dealing with a very high number of species. There are about 1.5 million invertebrate species currently described among the 2.2 million species described in total. And I often show this graph, which shows you that more than or nearly half of the species which are described so far are insects. And then we have the spiders, mites, and scorpions, mollusks, crustaceans, and so on. And only these blue areas here, these very small blue areas, these are the vertebrates. And the mammals are actually very, very tiny blue line here. But if we look at the global conservation efforts, they are mainly focusing, of course, on mammals and birds. So we want to increase the coverage of invertebrates in the IUCN. And this is not so easy because this means mainly we need to form new specialist groups which are dealing with those taxa. And we still have large gaps. Actually, the red parts of this pie chart show you which groups are already covered by the SSC. We have a very strong increase in groups. I mean, when I started in 2013 or no, 2010, I started with a grasshopper specialist group. At this time, there were only 4 specialist groups dealing with invertebrates. And now we have nearly 25, I think. And actually, the blue ones are the recent ones. We have added the wood lice and the earthworms, which are now covered by specialist groups. Still, the large gaps are particularly the beetles, because we cannot create one beetle specialist group. We have, because they have, well, 350,000 species or something like that of beetles. So we have to make sure that that we create smaller units. Currently, we have a ladybird group, we have a firefly specialist group, a dung beetle specialist group. There's currently a tiger beetle specialist group in formation, but it always takes a while, particularly to find the right leaders who really want to drive the process and yeah, create some action around these taxa. Yeah, I updated this list just a few minutes ago, so it's not everything is fine. Yeah, actually, I had yesterday made a complete new slide with a lot of new logos, but I didn't have the time now to completely rearrange it. But it shows you already these 25 groups which exist for invertebrates, which is quite a good progress we made recently. Still, invertebrates are neglected in the IUCN Red List. A few years ago, we have published a paper where we have shown that that particularly fungi, invertebrates, and plants are very much underrepresented on the IUCN Red List. You can see that the birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and fish, they have a coverage of more than 60%, while plants have only a coverage around 10%, invertebrates just about 2%, and fungi even less. And I've updated this graph just recently, and you will be surprised. There are a lot of changes actually in the graph since that time. So the last 4 years has changed a lot. But if you look at this part of the slides here, this is where you have the changes. Yeah, we meanwhile have a full coverage of birds, nearly full coverage of amphibians and mammals. Fish are also nearly fully covered. Reptiles are also quite well represented. And plants has also increased from 10 to 20% because of the global tree assessments. But still, invertebrates and fungi are hardly making any progress. It's not completely true, because if you look at the absolute numbers, we have now nearly 29,000 species of invertebrates on the IUCN Red List. And if I go back, there were 23,000 something. Which means we have about 5,500 new species on the IUCN Red List, which is as much as all mammal species, more or less. Yeah, so we have assessed a lot of species, but of course it's a lot of effort, and we do not have a lot of people who can voluntarily work on these Red List assessments. So Red List assessments are still important for us. During the last Congress, there was a motion submitted by the Invertebrate Conservation Committee together with the Fungal Conservation Committee, a motion called Strengthening Conservation Efforts for Fungi and Invertebrates. And we actually have mainly highlighted here that on all levels, like in protected areas, in the Red List, in policies, in key biodiversity areas, protected area management plans, and so on. In all these levels, invertebrates and fungi need to be considered more often. And this is something we have to work on in the next years to make sure that this motion will be, or this resolution will be really delivered. If we look at the species on the IUCN Red List, about 1/4 of the invertebrates are threatened by extinction. So 6% are critically endangered, 7% endangered, 10% vulnerable. And this means they have the same level of extinction risk as other taxa. 1/4 is usually the average amongst all the species. But you can also see that about another quarter is data deficient, which means we do not have enough data for these species to conduct a proper Red List assessment. Vicky has already talked about the Assess Plan Act cycle. I will not repeat this, but of course this is the thing which all the specialist groups in the IUCN deal with. And traditionally the focus was on assessments. I remember when I created the grasshopper specialist group together with my colleagues, we were discussing that there were not enough grasshopper species on the IUCN red list. We thought, well, they are completely underrepresented. We need to do something about that. So assessment was a little bit the reason why we formed the group. But we very soon realized that we also have to do something about it if we find a threatened species. So we actually started right at the beginning also to draft conservation action plans. And most important then also to implement those plans to really do conservation action on the ground. Just one example, which is, my favorite example, the crow-plain grasshopper, which is endemic to southern France. It only occurs in a very small area, a stone steppe in southern France. And we had the first contact with the protected area manager there in 2012. And in 2013, I sent 3 students there to collect some data on the ecology of the species. Because before you can do some conservation work, you need to have a little bit more knowledge. In this case, it was particularly important because we didn't know the threats of the species. And then a year later, we started to draft a conservation plan, a conservation strategy for the species. And you see here on this slide that a lot of stakeholders were present. There's a representative of the French army. There were people from the ministry, from the authorities, from NGOs, zoos, and so on. All the people who can help us to do something for the conservation of that species. And the most important threat we discovered was apparently associated to sheep grazing in this case, because I had a PhD student and she worked in that area, and she found that in habitats which are still occupied by the species, the vegetation height and vegetation cover was higher than in areas where the species went extinct, so the white parts here. So we thought, okay, maybe we should exclude grazing at least for a certain time. And this means we actually fenced an area here where the species was still present. And in 2015, there were only about 30 individuals left. And now we have reached in 2023 nearly 700 individuals. So actually this really worked, which means that the conservation can be quite easy. You do not always have to wait until everything is resolved from a scientific point of view. You just can turn your ideas into action and see if it works or not, of course, with all the evidence you have. So that is just my first introduction. And now I stop my screen sharing. And we will now go to the more interactive part of the of this workshop. Let me just... Okay, so you have proposed a few names of species, and I would like actually to use one of your favorite species actually to think about what kind of conservation action would be required. And as Vicky said, it is probably easier with species which do not have such a wide distribution, and it's often easier if we look for species which have a narrow distribution, like island endemics and so on, because then you can act with a very small number of stakeholders. Yeah, it's easier to work with those species than with, let's say, I see white and black rhinos there, which is of course a very different story. So can we just, how do we decide which species we take? Maybe you can write some suggestions in the chat. I see already pangolin there, tarantulas. Can we have one species rather than a group of species? That can be very helpful, because if we talk about all pangolins, okay, they probably have all the same threat, but a moth is also a very large group of species, so it would be better if we focus on one threatened species or a group of threatened moth species rather than one. Here I have one, Coelanthera kai. Okay. endangered in IUCN. Maybe that is a good idea. We just check this on the red list. The red list doesn't work. My computer, the red list does give an error. Can anybody access the IUCN red list currently? Or is it just my computer? Ah, now it works again. It's a little bit slow. I don't know what's wrong with my computer or with the website, but nevertheless, I have to wait. Okay, I cannot find Selantica Kai. Has anybody been able to find it on the IUCN red list? Because either my computer doesn't work properly currently, or it's not on the IUCN red list, or it's wrong written. Maybe the name is not perfectly written. Could that be the reason? Ah, okay, it's new, or probably a synonym. Oh yeah. Oh, that's a spider.
The red list website is also not opening on my hand, but it's not yet, from what I can say, I'm not sure it's updated yet on the red list, but it's not opening on my hand.
Yeah, it has worked now with my computer. That's a Parambiculum large burrowing spider. Okay, I think maybe we can use that. It has been assessed in 2008. And I think we have enough time to look into another species later. So we can keep the other names on the chat. And we'll start maybe with that species. Yeah. And of course, the best or the most important thing to consider is always, what do we know about the species? As Vicky said, it's very important to have good knowledge on the species. And Aswati, have you worked on that species before? Yes, okay, so you know probably enough. Okay, then probably you can help us a little bit to get that information for that species. I see there's a hand raised in Adeyemi Blessing. Can she speak, or he? Is it possible for them to speak? No? Okay, then you have to write your question or whatever in the chat. Yeah, there are a lot of species coming. Now, I think we will start with that spider, and maybe I share my screen because I can access can access the IUCN red list now. Let me just wait. Okay.
Do you want people to go onto the Miro board as well?
Yes, we can do that as well. But maybe first we introduce a little bit that species using the red list, because ideally we would have, before we think about what kind of action is necessary, we would make something like a status review. That is often the first part of the conservation action plan, yeah, which means to have a complete overview of that species and about its status, where is its distribution, what are the major threats, what is its ecology, so what are the basic requirements of the species. And the key thing to consider is, of course, the threats. Yeah, because when we wanted to engage in conservation action, we somehow need to mitigate the threats. So you probably see my screen here. So that is the website, the IUCN website for the spider species. And maybe we look first into the map. You can see it's endemic to the Chupikarala, at least Western Ghats in southern India, which makes it already a little bit a hotspot species. So it's quite a good choice. Of course, the global hotspots of biodiversity are always worth of doing some conservation action. And you probably know how to navigate through the red list. I actually preferred the old version where you can see everything in detail. Here you always have to look into all these single sections. So we scroll a little bit down. It's endangered. B1, A, B2, 3. That means it is endangered based upon its range size, extent of occurrence, together with A, which is a low number of locations or a severe fragmentation, and B means a continuing decline in 2 and 3. I don't have everything in my head, but that 3 should be habitat and 2 should be AOO, I think the area of occupancy. And this was assessed in 2008, which means it needs already to be updated. It's a little bit outdated assessment, but nevertheless, we hope that it's still valid. And then we can read the justification. The species is recorded from the South and Western Ghats. The habitat, other than protected area where the species occurs, is completely degraded due to road cutting or expansion and logging of wood. Pressure on the forest is increasing. It's assumed that the area of habitat in one known location and the inferred range has decreased over the years. Population is fragmented and found in less than 5 locations. The species categorized as endangered because of its small range, its occurrence in less than 5 fragmented locations, and due to continuing decline in area and habitat quality. So, okay, we know a little bit the general outline of that species. We have the range. The first thing when we consider the range is, of course, we do not need to read the text here, but if we look at the map, that gives us a lot of information. And the first thing we have to think about is there an overlap with protected areas here? Because protected area managers can probably help us to do some conservation action for that species. And also which are the main authorities in that region who we have to deal with, yeah? Thinking about the stakeholders is important, and the range gives you some information on that. Let's go down again. Now, first we look into the population. Of course, that's quite typical for all invertebrate species. So the population information is not available, its distribution is patchy. Further surveys are required and so on, less than 5 locations. Based on that, I would assume it's not very well known how widely it is distributed. So there's probably gaps in the data. So maybe that is also something to consider when you think about the action, to also include something like a survey on where does its species occur. Yeah. Then the habitat and ecology. Species found in most deciduous forest and evergreen rainforest. So that is actually quite clear. Species, the spider prepares burrows on roadside bunds and requires vegetation cover over the bund. Nothing is known of its breeding biology. The thing is, if we think about conservation action, we need to know what kind of habitat the species requires, and if there are some special structures like vegetation cover, yeah, that is important. What the species needs. Maybe the breeding biology is not so important initially, yeah, because as soon as we want to engage in situ conservation of that species, it's most important to provide a suitable habitat for that species. Yeah, so maybe it's not so important to think about its breeding biology now, but nevertheless, it might be worth, if you want to go into ex situ breeding, for example, then it's important to know something on breeding biology. And now we come to the important part, to the threats. So habitat loss and degradation are major threats. That is clear. It's a little bit vague. So why is the habitat lost? Yeah, so maybe that's given afterwards. The recent records of the species are only from protected areas. Okay, here we are. So that means we need to know which protected areas are involved and how can we engage in that. Surveys outside Parambiculum and Indira Gandhi wildlife sanctuaries do not reveal the presence of the species, which implies its dependence on protection and preservation of habitat. An additional threat to the species is collection of international pet traders. Here we have the second threat, So over collection, because tarantulas are of course often traded and kept by people who love them, which could have an impact on the population. The two threats in tandem could result in species extinction and so on. Okay, so these are two major threats. So if we go into the exercise, think about these threats. What can we do about them? Yeah, use and trade is probably filled here. No, it's not filled, but it was mentioned there. Conservation actions is also, of course, important. Occurs in these two protected areas. Further surveys are required to know their presence in other protected areas. Species requires protection at the national level by being included in the Indian Wildlife Protection Act. It is also important that the species included under the CITES Appendix 2 to safeguard it from unsustainable trade. Okay, that was it. That was actually all the information we have. And I stop my screen sharing here. And we have now created this mirror file. I think the link was already shared on the chat. So it would be great if you could actually enter that, and maybe we can delete all the things we have already entered.
Yeah, I think it's just been reshared on the chat. If people
Okay.
haven't, if you can click on it and go into
Yeah,
the
I
mirror
see already
board.
names of people, which is good. And what you can do here is actually to create a note or something. We have already some things here which I can move a little bit around. So first of all, you can move anything below stakeholders. So to mention those people or those organizations which you think are most important to start some conservation action for that species. So yeah, that's good. Thank you for sharing. Then we can actually put the species on the top. Okay. So I give the common name here, doesn't matter too much, which is just gives you information which species we are talking about. I'm not sure how, sorry, I'm not so familiar with that tool yet. Then we have threats, and we have to think about the actions which we would like to add here. So the first threat is deforestation or forest degradation or whatever. I call it deforestation here, okay? And the second one would be overconsumption. I don't know, it's not consumption in this case, over-collecting. Okay. So these are two threats. And now you can actually add your suggestions, what would be the most important actions for these threats. Okay?
You can use sticky notes are over here. If you click on and then type in, it's fairly easy.
Yeah. I delete this part. Okay. So please just pick a sticky note. Yeah, like you see, maybe Vicky, you can show it again how it works, and just enter.
If you click on and choose a sticky note color, doesn't matter what color,
Yeah.
and then pop it onto and then you can type in. Somebody can take that one if they want and type into it. Yeah, that's it. People are having a go.
Great. Good.
That's it.
Now you just have to enter something. Write a suggestion. Don't worry about proper English also. We are just doing a very random exercise here.
Great. That's great. Expansion of road.
Something's going on, yeah. Okay, that's another threat, right? Okay, expansions of the first area, good. I see local communities here. That's actually not me. Okay. Forest restoration is one of the actions proposed. Probably a good idea, but we'll probably discuss how to do that. Forest fire is also given here as a threat. As by Aswati, you know the case better. Very good. Thank you. I see some things already appearing here. Okay. There's one action here. Okay, that's called assessment of population distribution and dynamics across time. It's probably important. It's a little bit like monitoring, right? So whenever we do conservation, we want to do monitoring. And I've shown you the data of the crow plain grasshopper, where we have actually shown that conservation works, and we would not be able to show that if we wouldn't have that population data. Yeah, so it is important to get some data. It doesn't need to be a proper number of individuals in that area. It can also be any assessment which is somehow standardized. Yeah, it could be a transact count, could be a relative density, something like that, so that we see if the trend is increasing or decreasing. Okay, it's already forming a little bit here. Stakeholders, NGOs, local governments, land managers, local communities. Okay. I see also government there, which is the regional government. Good. The IUCN. Okay. Actually, I would say in this case, the IUCN, you have to think about a little bit clearer who in the IUCN would be the stakeholder, because the IUCN is such a large and complex group. And for example, if we talk about India, we either think about Indian IUCN members, or we look for a specialist group. And for example, there is a South Asian species specialist group, which have in fact assessed the species. So Sanjay Molur, who has assessed the species, he is also chair of the South Asian Invertebrate Specialist Group. Forest and Wildlife National Tiger. What is there? Okay. Conservation Authority. Oh, that's Danish. Danish probably knows the case because he's from that area, from Kerala. So he knows whom to contact. And of course, we have to make sure that the conservation the conservation action we want to propose is also in line with other actors. So if there is a strong strong actor like tiger conservation or something like that, we have to make sure that they are somehow involved. So there is a lot of things going on here. Kerala Forest Department, yeah, they are more or less the main managers of these areas, if I understand correctly, right? So let me go in here and I will make a change to the IUCN here and call it IUCN SSC South Asian Invertebrate. See? Does anybody know if India has a national IUCN national committee? Because they are also in some countries, there are national committees. Well, I can try to Google it. Yeah, there is an Indian national. Okay, thank you. So that would be also one stakeholder we can involve, of course. Mhm. Yeah, there are some other stakeholders suggested here. Invertebrate researchers, for example, particularly those who know the species would be very important. Yes, so those people who have really good knowledge of the ecology of the species, because often, particularly in invertebrates, not so many things are published. So often the knowledge may be just personal knowledge of people. WCPA is also a good idea to think about other commissions. There's also the Commission on Ecosystem Management, for example. And of course, we're dealing here with protected areas, so the WCPA makes a lot of sense. Local universities, yeah, they probably have those researchers. Yeah, so we can actually somehow link it over here. And I will try to keep the same color for the stakeholders. Okay, it's already a lot of suggestions, yeah. Now maybe we look a little bit into the actions which have been proposed here. So that is illegal trade is also a threat. So that is part of the over collection. So it's related to the threats here. I take the same color. Expansion of roads is a little bit related to deforestation or habitat loss and fragmentation. And oh no, that's not the right color. Not so easy. Then forest fire. Oh, maybe we put this a little bit in a different order. Sorry. Natural disaster is, of course, a little bit climate change related. Low species awareness. Yeah, I mean, that means it's not really, of course, a threat, but of course, it is often a problem when we talk about invertebrates that a lot of people are not so much aware or why the species is important, why we do have something to do about this. So it may require also a little bit work, but I give this a different color because it's a little bit different issue. Some red. Yeah, it's the same here, not charismatic. Well, I think these people who collect them are not of the same opinion. Loss of genetic diversity, high vulnerability to disease and mass extinctions. That's related to the deforestation, of course, because it's more or less a consequence of that threat of deforestation, right? Restriction on trade of that species, that would be an action. Good. Let's keep the actions down here. Okay. Natural disasters was here, not charismatic ones here. Lack of knowledge about the biodiversity and the threat status is also part of that lack of knowledge part here. I keep these here. Okay, good. And then we have here a lot of actions in one field, which is quite large. Assessment of population. I will try to move this into several fields if you agree. Maybe put a new field here and just copy paste it from here. If I can do that. Yeah, okay. I start with the first one. So assessment, so that is actually survey and monitoring, right? Okay. Then community engagement, conservation campaign at school and local communities. Okay, I keep this new slide. And then the other one can stay in this one. Overcome overcollection in the wild. Breeding facility would be important. Preventing people from doing wild catch. Okay, we have breeding facility already here, so I think we need it only once. So we'll delete this. We have the breeding facility. Okay. A lot of things going on. We have indigenous people, very good. It's new. We have already a lot of stakeholders, right? So maybe that is good for a start. You can stop writing, and maybe we can really try to order everything a little bit and see what else we can discuss about this. Just see if I've missed anything. Okay. So first of all, in the left part, we see all the stakeholders, and finding the right stakeholders is absolutely key. And of course, it was very good here that we have some people in the group who know this region, for example, Danish and Aswati probably as well. So they have already mentioned very specific actors, yeah, like the Forest and Wildlife National Tiger Conservation Authority, like the Kerala Forest Department, and so on. These are apparently actors we definitely would need to involve. And how would we do that? Yeah, so that is also a very important question. And the thing is that you can make a workshop to invite everybody, but that would be, for me, always a second step. The first step would always be to contact the right persons directly. Yeah, and the directer the contact, the better the outcome. Yeah, so if you speak to people from face to face, you will have a better result than writing an email. Yeah, people do not answer a lot of emails. So taking a telephone call would certainly be better. Or if you directly find the right people. And often it's not so easy because people are busy, yeah. So they may not immediately be very enthusiastic about your plans to do some conservation work for that spider. But of course, you can convince them, and you may just need to find the right people in these authorities. Yeah, because these are a diverse set of people, and all of us are human. Some have more interest in spider conservation than others, and also some may be just too busy. Yeah, so finding the right people may just be some workload, and you just need to follow up on that. You just have to make sure to get them on board. And if you don't know them, it may also be helpful if you have contact to other people who know them, like via NGOs and so on. Maybe Vicky, you have also some comments on that.
Yeah, I was going to say the most powerful thing, if at all possible, is to get them out on the ground and physically see the species and talk them through the species and make it come to life for them. Using pictures and things can be also really powerful. Because and also understanding what they do and how the species might fit into what they do as well. Because like Axel says, people are busy, they have a lot to do, but kind of putting something into context, making it come to life and making it applicable to what they're already doing are all great ways. But yeah, definitely face to face. If not, if you can't do face to face, there's always Zoom. That's the thing, you can always Zoom people, even if you can't physically get out and meet them and show them the species, you can always get them on Zoom and show them pictures and talk them through the species that way.
Yeah. One thing which is often important is if you really can bring them to the field. If you can show them the species in the field, that changes often a lot for people, because a lot of the decisions humans are making are done via emotions. Yeah, so not so much by convincing them that it's an important species, that it's threatened, or that it is somehow providing ecosystem services. So the facts are usually not so interesting for people. The most important thing is, for me, the most important argument is always that each and every species has more or less a right to exist on the planet. Yeah, and then if we show them the species and its habitat and show them the problems on the ground, then they may understand that something has to be done. So an excursion can really help also to convince people that something needs to be done. But that is about stakeholder involvement. So stakeholders are really important. And I saw also here community engagement, conservation campaign at schools and local communities. Of course, these two things are somehow related. Yeah, so that is more or less the outreach work you have to do. And while the stakeholders are much more important because they are the ones who will help you to facilitate the action or to implement the action on the ground, the community can still be involved and needs to be somehow. It's good if let's say the neighboring villages know that the species is there and that it's threatened, and that there's a maybe conservation project which even may provide them some jobs or whatever. Then, or if they see that it's a species which is named after a village or a region, that gives them a kind of responsibility for that species, right? So I move this over here. These are more or less the activities based upon this. But I would, if I was a funder, I would, if I would need to fund the conservation work for that species and would see just community engagement, I would say, okay, what does it really bring? Yeah, so I see a lot of proposals in my role on the advisory board of the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund for people just say, well, we want to make an awareness campaign. But the awareness campaign will not save the species from extinction in the end. The most important thing is, of course, to engage with the right stakeholders, but it's of course good if it's somehow also promoted on the more wider public level, that the species know, oh, there is. But the most important thing are always the stakeholders and not the general public. Yeah. Do you agree, Vicky?
Yeah, no, I do. I was going to say with this species, because there's a trade issue, there might be local, sort of local villages that may be engaged in the trade, and there may be a specific element of community outreach that you may do with those kind of specific local communities that may be involved in the trade of this species. So yeah, you always want to have some sort of conservation outcome in mind, not just, as Axel says, general sort of outreach isn't very useful.
Good. Yeah, that's a really good point. Very good to highlight that, because of that over collecting. If the local community is engaged in over collecting, then it's important to show them. I mean, that they are also, well, somehow working against their own income if they overexploit that species, right? Okay. Now we go to the threats again. The first thing is deforestation. Of course, deforestation is such a large threat. It is very difficult for us as single people to do something against deforestation. We can only work together with authorities or NGOs on that. Yeah, it's not easy to engage in action against deforestation. But of course, on a small scale, it may be possible. Yeah, if there is, for example, a community which has a part of degraded land which they may not use anymore or whatever, then of course you can try to engage with the right people to see if this part of the range can be restored. Yeah, if there's some restoration can be initiated. But of course, as I said, it's difficult to do that alone. Yeah, so it's important that you find the right people who help you to do something against that.
It might be that the protected area, if they've got some sort of patrols against sort of deforestation, if it's illegal deforestation going on, it might be mapping this species to kind of see exactly where its distribution overlaps, so either with illegal threats or existing sort of legal potential deforestation that's happening, to try and identify areas that might be protected or could be integrated into sort of patrol work. Yeah, so there can be ways of sort of integrating it into what's going on.
That's a very important point again. Good information on the spatial distribution of that species is really important. Yeah. We had this here somewhere. Where was it? When we came to the assessment of population distribution and dynamics across time. Yeah. So that area is really important, because the more specific you know the distribution of that species, the better you can specify your actions. Yeah. So maybe you find out that there's a small relic population of that species occurring in a certain area, and you know the community and you can do something about it. Yeah. If you just have the rough range map of the IUCN Red List, it doesn't really help you because it's far too coarse. Yeah. It just shows you the general distribution of that species. Yeah. You need to know the exact localities of that species. Oh, I see a couple of comments in the chat. There's one. Since the species occurs in the tiger reserve, annual tiger censuses are conducted, which primarily focus on tigers and the prey. However, associated fauna such as this species typically excluded from these studies. So they can be included. Yeah, sure. You can use or try to convince them, if it's easy to spot, if it's easy to identify, to include them in their surveys. That's a good idea. And there's also from Aswati, in this case, if local communities are involved in the illegal collection, how can we convince them about the importance and value, because these species will be more focused on profits they get through this trade? Yeah, sure. That is a big issue. I must say I have never engaged in similar cases before, but usually what people try to develop are alternative livelihoods. Yeah, because as you said, the people somehow need money. This is why they do it. So if you can provide anything where they can gain money in a better way, yeah, without maybe even by conserving that species, that is always helpful. Yeah, because there's also somebody who's in penalties and implementing laws, and it's not the best way forward with penalties, because as long as there's a very strong financial benefit, there's always a motivation to also do some illegal collection or whatever. Nevertheless, it's important to engage also in this. Yes, somebody wrote here that the restriction on trade of a species is mentioned here, which means that, of course, it could be included in CITES. And that is exactly what a lot of specialist groups in the IUCN are doing. Yeah, they engage with the international, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, to list that species on one of the annexes, for example. Sorry, yeah. So who would be then the actor? This could be the South Asian invertebrate specialist group, but of course there is another one, the spider and scorpion specialist group, which could be us. No? Yeah, so I would probably try to involve also these, because they are often the species experts. Okay.
I was just going to say on the sort of potential trade, like the breeding facility's been mentioned as like a possibility, because obviously breeding can be used to kind of do reintroductions and translocations, but obviously it could also be used to provide a sort of more sustainable form of source for like pet trade. So I don't know, it is a bit complicated, and it's not the easiest thing to look at, but you could potentially look at doing a breeding facility, to provide to the pet trade. And again, those that are involved in the illegal trade, whether you could look at using that as an income source for those communities might be a possibility. It's it's not an easy thing to do, and it's quite complex to do that. But it is something that could be explored in terms of its feasibility.
Yeah, definitely. But always be aware that captive breeding is by far not easy. So it depends. I mean, you need maybe in spiders it is. I don't know. I'm not a spider expert, but of course, it's good if you want to do captive breeding to liaise with people who have some experience in spider breeding. It's probably possible. And then, as Vicky said, yeah, the breeding facility can, of course, produce individuals also for the pet trade. There was a case a few years ago when a very large Colombian beetle was over collected, and then there was a Chinese breeder who bred them, and this very expensive beetle became cheaper and cheaper over time. Yeah, because there were such a large number of individuals bred in the breeding facility, and after that happened, the species was suddenly listed on CITES because people wanted to prevent the overexploitation in the natural range. But that also meant that the captive breeder couldn't sell them anymore. And for that reason, the illegal trade started to really flourish. Yeah, because people still wanted to collect it and they went back to the wild population. So that has to be very, very thoroughly thought about how you would create a strategy to really, yeah, reduce the overcollection in the area. And awareness alone is probably not sufficient because even if you can convince some people in the area that it's not good to overcollect, there will always be some who you cannot convince and who will still want the financial benefits of collecting this species. Yeah, nevertheless, I think some important points here, because habitat loss is one of the threats, is to see where can I restore habitats, where can I protect existing habitats. That's always the first step, to see where the species occurs. Is this area where it occurs well protected, and can it be somehow expanded? Because from my experience, if we expand the habitat of a species, then it can also naturally move to other places and expand actually its range. Yeah, so that can work. Second option would be if you can restore an area somewhere else to somehow translocate the species to somewhere else. Like Vicky said, reintroductions and so on are becoming more and more yeah, common. But the thing is, translocations are also not so easy. Yeah, so they also need to be very well prepared. You need to make sure that the habitat is really in a good shape where you translocate individuals. You have to think about how many individuals do you have to translocate so that it can build a self-sustaining population there, and to monitor also the population trend over time. So it's really something more long-term, but still can be considered if you do a conservation plan and if you have sufficient resources. So it always depends a little bit on the budget you have. If you have just a small amount of budget, like let's say the small grant from the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund, you can probably not engage in everything. Yeah, you have to pick out the thing which you think is most important. In this case, I would say maintaining the habitats where it occurs and trying to expand them would be probably the best strategy, and somehow to prevent them from illegal collecting, which could be either by making collecting less attractive, or really by a good protection of these individuals from collecting. Yeah. Okay, I think that was already quite a good exercise. Just look, and I think it's already quite late, so we probably cannot discuss another one. So I would suggest I go to my next presentation, okay? Let's work here. Okay. So if you have any questions left, I mean, somebody wrote in the chat, how can you contact us? I think our emails are available somewhere on the internet, but we can also share them here. I don't mind really. So we will share them at the end of this webinar. So I will share my screen again, and we'll talk a little bit on the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund and what it is about and what is important if you want to obtain funding. And I've seen a couple of names here who I am familiar with because they either have obtained already funding or they have unsuccessfully applied for funding. Both happens. And the thing is that the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund has been founded, I think, in 2009. I think I have some information here. And it was established by the president of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed. At this time, he was the crown prince. And he wanted to support support species conservation, and particularly the actors in species conservation, so people who are engaging in species conservation. And the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund distributes each year $1.5 million. And this actually has slightly increased recently because the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund is also maintaining the grant of the Fonseca Leadership Program, a small grant, so that there's meanwhile a little bit higher value, and also the endowment by the president has been increased so that in the future it will be more money available, which is good. And there are 3 application rounds each year. Usually the application deadlines were, I think, end of February, end of June, and end of October. I think it has been moved now to mid-October, so the last one is already gone. But there are 3 deadlines, so it's not such a big issue that if you miss one, I mean, you can always come to a later date. So it doesn't take so much time until the funding decisions are made. Then the budget is allocated to the different taxa, and the budget for each taxon is based upon the funds which are requested in the preceding year. So if we receive a lot of proposals for mammals, which is usually the case, mammals receive the majority of the funds. Yeah. So the funds available for mammals are larger than for invertebrates, but there are also far more applications for mammals than for invertebrates. The maximum grant size is $25,000, but this size, so $25,000, are rarely given to a single project. There are some exceptions, and particularly in the birds, that happens more often because the bird people are very experienced in writing very good proposals. And writing very good proposals means they focus really on threat mitigation. So as this exercise we have just done, to see what is the major threat, what can we do about it? That is the main thing the grant wants to fund in the end. And the invertebrate proposals we have funded in the recent years were always below 10,000. Usually 5,000 is a good value to start with if you want to receive a fund. And the criteria are manifold. One is the IUCN Red List status. Of course, we would prefer species which are at risk of extinction. So we don't want to fund a project for honeybees, for example, because honeybees are a domestic species. They are common and they are not threatened. Yeah, so we want to fund species which are highly threatened. But of course, not only threatened species. In invertebrates, we have also a lot of not listed species and data deficient species. And these are, of course, also fundable because if you can explain that the species is threatened, then it's also fine. Yeah, you always can write a text to say, okay, I know that the species is strongly decreasing because of this and that, and that's fine as well. The primary focus is in situ conservation, which means we do not usually fund breeding programs. And the main focus is, of course, threat mitigation. There are some things which I think are important to consider. The first thing is you really need to know your species. I reviewed so many proposals in recent years, and sometimes I have seen really texts who just copy-paste the information from the red list and wrote some general lines about it. and you immediately see that this person doesn't have any knowledge of a species, and that doesn't really help. Yeah, we want to fund people who really have some engagement, who want to focus on a species. And if you don't have that, you can collect some data before in the field, or maybe read all the literature, really obtain some really good knowledge on the species. The most important information, as we said, are what are the major habitat requirements of that species? So what kind of habitat does it need, and what are the major threats? So these are the really most important information. The second thing is focus on threat mitigation. Again, the same exercise we just have done, which means if you know the threat to a species, please think about what can be done about it. Because we receive so many proposals where people write, okay, this species is, for example, threatened by invasive alien species. And then if you look for their objectives and actions, they just write, they want to make a survey and some general awareness raising. Yeah. So, and that doesn't really help it. If you know the threat, you can start doing something against it. Of course, it's not easy to control invasive species. You cannot just write, okay, I will eradicate an invasive species from wherever. Yeah. But of course, you can at least try to do something in this direction, or maybe find the right collaborators who have the skills to do that, or maybe to control the invasive species in a certain area. We had a very good project some years ago for an island where they actually built a fence to protect the population of a threatened snail from invasive species. Surveys are always in each and every proposals I get, and that's fine, particularly, as I said, it's important to have some knowledge on the species and its distribution but the focus of your proposal should not be research. Yeah, we get also a couple of proposals where people apparently just want to get some additional funding for their PhD, and they just have a research question to answer, and there's no link to the real conservation action on the ground. Yeah, this is what we do not fund. There are some exceptions, of course. If the threat is unknown, then we need to do some research on the threats. If we know that the species is decreasing, but we don't know why, we want to find out, that's of course fine. Then we just made this exercise, collaborate with stakeholders. Yeah, who are the major actors in the field? Do we know them? Can you somehow work with them together? Because we also don't want to see that there are some people working in the same region without working with each other, yeah, or working even against each other. That doesn't really work. Yeah, so it's good to work with the right people, NGOs or authorities who have already a project in the region. Or is there already a project for that species in place? Yeah, particularly if you deal with mammals and birds, that happens very often, that there is already a conservation project for that species, and you may want to work with them together rather than starting your own thing, and make sure that you find the right synergies to find the best conservation outcome. The next thing is provide this details as much as is possible. Yeah. So what kind of methods do you use? For example, if you write you want to do a survey, how do you do that? Often the people do not really specify how they want to do something. Sometimes I had proposals where people just write, okay, I want to restore the habitat, and that is not sufficient. Yeah, I want to know how would you like to. I mean, habitat restoration is nothing easy. Yeah, you have to think about how it can be done, and you need maybe to reach out to the right stakeholders who have the experience, and maybe you have already a site in mind where you can do some habitat restoration that should be somehow specified, so that we can better assess how realistic this plan is. Because if you have only $5,000, you cannot do a very large-scale habitat restoration project, of course. Also, if the methods have already been used, or if they have shown to be successful. But of course, there is also space for experimental approaches. So if you think there is a way, but you don't know if it really works, and you want to try it out, if you can, let's say, promote a food plant by a certain technique, that's of course possible as well. But just be very clear about this. You just don't write, yeah, we want to do this and that, but you can always write why you want to do this and how you want to do this, and also if it is more experimental to see if it works. Yeah, that's completely fine. Yeah, and then survey and awareness. That's really 80% of the proposals we receive for Invertebrates are just all the same. Don't copy paste from other proposals. Sometimes I sometimes came across proposals which were 100% copied from other proposals, and just the species name was exchanged. Of course, it doesn't really work. We had one case where apparently a couple of people were copying from each other and sometimes even forgot to replace the species name, which is not really very useful. So it's really important that you think about the most important steps to do for preserving the species, and not just survey and awareness raising, because that is just a very general statement. Yeah, as we said before, you need to find the right actors. If there's illegal trade, who is involved in that? Who is really the right actor to work with to get things changing? Yeah, not just to inform people. I mean, the general public will not be really so much interested maybe in a protection of, let's say, this grasshopper or whatever. Yeah, so it's more important maybe to inform the farmer who is managing the land, or the landowner, or whoever. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's also some other things which are important to consider. The language of the proposals is, of course, English. It doesn't need to be perfect. Yeah, we are aware that most of you are not not native English speakers. I'm also not a native English speaker, so I'm completely happy if it's not perfect English. No, don't worry about that too much. Of course, we need to understand it, but it's not so important that everything is in right grammar or whatever. Of course, there is increasing use of AI now to translate text. That is a little bit dangerous, because AI sometimes use just so general wording that then the proposal may read just like a completely AI generated proposal. And then this means, for me again, you don't have any knowledge of that species. So what we usually look for, if people have already worked for the species, that you can show the evidence that you have done some work with that species before. Yeah, for example, some people have even described a species and then want to engage in the conservation of that species, and it's completely evident for me that this person has a sufficient knowledge. But if you just pick a random species like we did now with a spider, most of us have no knowledge. So that's better if we have people who really know this species. Newbies, yeah. If you submit your first proposal, better don't ask for a large amount. Better for a smaller amount. $5,000 is usually what we recommend for newbies if they don't have a really good, high quality conservation project. And also, these smaller grants have a higher chance to obtain funding. For example, I have a budget of about $50,000 each round for invertebrates. So if I can fund 10 proposals with $5,000, I would prefer this over 2 projects with $25,000, because I want to fund as many projects as possible. Also, there's always the questions if you had any relationships with a fund before. There is a database in the background where we can look if people had relationships with the fund. And I usually always test this. And I'm really annoyed if people write they never had any relationship with a fund, but then I see they have already submitted 3 or 4 applications. It doesn't really matter if you apply once or twice or 10 times. It is possible. There's no risk of doing that. You can do that and just be honest and write, okay, I had already 3 proposals, but none of them were funded. Actually, that shows me as a reviewer that you apparently are very engaged and really want this funding for this project. And then I have a higher inclination to fund it. Yeah, so a higher likelihood to fund it if you stick to this project. Also, that's something which happens often. People write a typical survey and awareness proposal, and some of them get funded because we do not get really so many good proposals. And then the next proposal we write is again more or less the same, but with another species. Yeah, I would prefer if you stick to the species you have picked before, And if you would follow up on the work you have done before, yeah, if you have already now done the survey work and you know the threats, then please start with this threat mitigation. Actually, we received a few proposals which were really good in this regard. That in the first round they had $5,000 for a survey and finding out the threats. In the second round, they really started some action to mitigate the threats. One thing which is important, if you are a member of an IUCN SSC group, please mention this. There is a field to mention this. Some people forget it, but for us, it's also an indication that you are connected to the right people. And of course, you can contact your chair of the specialist group and ask him if you can provide the name in the references. So usually we look into the name of references, and if they are only people mentioned from the same organization where the person is working, it doesn't really show that it's not so convincing. It's better if you have really also some external affiliates or references who can support you. We do not expect it from young students that they provide a very long list of references, but at least to show that you're somehow connected to the right people is important. Again, mention the major threats of the species and list the objectives, how you want to address these threats. And if you do not have a very high budget, then it might be important to just pick the most important threat and maybe just pick one locality and see if you can work there rather than trying to solve the complete problems in a small grant. So be realistic what can be achieved with the limited time and the limited budget. In the CVs we receive, they are often very academic because many of the people who are providing applications, proposals, they are from the academic world. I'm not very interested in long publications lists. I mean, as long as you don't mention the publication list that you have worked on the species or have published something on the ecology or threats or the taxonomy of those species, where I can see, okay, this person is really working with these species, and make sure that these publications really exist because I often read them. So that is important, but you do not need, it's not so important to show your academic career. It would be far more important to show how you have already worked with conservation or how you intend to do so, because we do not expect that everybody of you has already a very long experience in conservation. Then you are also asked to provide a photo of your own. And of course, that should not be a mugshot. That should be a photo, ideally, of you in the field. Yeah, we love to see people working in the field with that species or whatever, to see them somewhere in the mud rather than with the perfect dressing for whatever job. Species photos, of course, it's sometimes difficult. If you don't have own photos, you can use others, but mention this. I also get these artificial proposals where people just pick the first species they find on the internet, and sometimes it's the wrong species, and you see, okay, the person has no idea about the species, and it's done. References already mentioned. Budget, of course, the budget needs to be a little bit more precise than what we usually receive. Would be good if you at least provide the numbers you have used to estimate your costs. And I mean, we usually try to fund those costs which are associated with the project. So if we get a proposal from ornithologists for a bird conservation project, we are very surprised if they ask for binoculars, because we would expect that bird people have binoculars. Yeah, so we would more be keen than to provide the material to build the fences to exclude invasive species or whatever you want. Yeah, and as I said, be very careful with using ChatGPT. I mean, there are meanwhile also AI detectors we are using from time to time to see if something is completely AI generated. And if you translate your text with ChatGPT, this AI detector will also detect that it was translated with ChatGPT, but it will not indicate that. It will just show me it was written with ChatGPT. And of course, that would be a shame. I do that, and I have I have last round, I have funded a project which was 100% ChatGPT proposal, but nevertheless from the CV and so on, I saw that the person had really good knowledge of the species, so it was probably just a translation. Okay, that was it about the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund. I'll stop the screen sharing here.
Thank you so much, Axel, for that wonderful presentation. Just a quick one. There's one question before we round up. Someone is asking that what if our species, the target species they want to work on is not listed on the red list?
Yeah, I mean, you can do the same exercise we have done, but you need to get the information from elsewhere. And I mean, that means you need to contact the right people. If they are species experts on the planet who have worked on the species, you can look for the scientific literature on Google Scholar and see what is known, and then contact the authors and ask them if they have ideas about the major threats and so on. So you can pick any species you want. As I said, for the Mohammed bin Zayed Fund, it can be a non-listed species, but it's good if you at least justify it to say, okay, a species has a restricted range, it's likely to be threatened because the habitat is degraded or whatever. Yeah, so that's completely fine for me.
All right. Thank you so much, Axel. Thank you so much, Vicky. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Today has been a great time of learning. I've learned so much about how to go about conservation action, and I'm sure that every other person on this call would agree with me. Would also be, for everybody on this call, I would say that you'll be receiving follow-up emails on how you can contact Axel and Vicky. We'll also send you mails, because I can see someone is asking how you can join IUCN Species Specialist Group. We'll also be telling you how to go about that if you want to join. And we'll also be giving you other information that you can follow up on. And thank you so much, everyone. It was nice to have this webinar. All right, then. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.